Shireen is a pediatrician, and Mike is Westminster Seminary trained. That is MDiv there, and they have 3 adult children. One of whom is in healthcare, right?
Yes, nurse in Portland, Oregon.
Wow. Yep. He's a Cubs and Bears fan despite living in Philadelphia.
Whoa.
Which I don't get that.
It was a rough day today.
Rough day Thursday.
The Cubs and the Bears are always going to have rough days, I've heard.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So he was planning on going to med school at one point, but ended up going to seminary instead. But ended up the spouse of a physician. And both were interested at one point in South America. Is that right? Both of you guys? Yeah. But ended up staying. Taught an Old Testament at Westminster Seminary for 20 years, which I knew. We were both students together. So that
It was a long time. It was a couple of years ago. Let's just say that.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So I got a Master's of Arts, and he got a did. Yep. And also, too, has worked for CCO, Coalition for Christian Outreach, which is a campus ministry type organization, and then InterServe, which is a senior organization in the Philadelphia area. So he's had, those are his job credentials. And he's going to speak to us today on the question of identity and a life of servanthood, getting the order straight. And we'll let him expand on that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike Kelly.
Okay.
Thank you for being here.
All right, it's good to be here. Wow, I feel like I'm really far away. I'm at a Baptist church again. I know what it's like to preach at a Baptist church. It's very similar. So, as Dr. Larry said, I was interested in medicine when I started my undergrad. And I want to tell you a little bit about my own journey that works. I was very interested I was good at science, just put it that way. And my guess is that if you're in healthcare, that you will probably, I hope, you had at least some affinity to science and you were pretty good at science. And I was really interested in serving people. That was mine. I wanted to help people. And I think, if I'm honest with myself, there were some other motivations, but I think that those two things came together for me in a perceived desire, interest in going career in healthcare. Good at science, and I wanted to serve people. So, just a question to you as we start tonight, and as we think about this question of identity and the life of servanthood, and where we're going to go with that is something very important to me is to get the order straight. And so the cheater is, we are going to challenge ourselves to think about coming to the point of servanthood, not as deriving our identity, but coming to a point of servanthood as something that arises out of our identity. So we're going to get that, we're going to think about getting that order right. So just a question to you is just kind of pondering as we start tonight, your own journey into healthcare. Recently I was talking to a 4th year medical student. I don't know if you have any 4th year medical students. I know we have a 1st year, 4th year. Okay, so my wife Shireen is on the other side of the question of 4th year medical student questions of applying to residencies, and she's kind of sifting through a lot of applications to residencies. So I was talking to this 4th year medical student, and I asked her just kind of this question. It wasn't in preparation for this talk or anything, but I said, so kind of tell me about your own journey in healthcare. Like how did you end up here? How did you end up a 4th year student? And it's interesting, she said the same thing. She said, well, it was kind of an accident. I mean, I didn't have this big revelation from God that you should go to medical school or anything like that. She said, I was always kind of at the top of my class. I was a smart kid, and I really loved science. But what I really loved mostly was I wanted to serve people. I wanted to help people. I wanted to alleviate suffering, in some sense, with people. And that alleviation of suffering is something that, if we think about that, when we think about serving in healthcare, to put a theological bent on that, we could start to talk, and we'll come back to this a couple times tonight, to talk about the alleviation of suffering as the coming of this word, very important biblical word, shalom, into the world, of shalom, of God's wholeness, of his intention for his creation and his people to flourish. The reality is that humans, I think we all can all say this, that humans suffer from a real definite lack of shalom. We seem to be wired in a way that moves us away from flourishing oftentimes. We tend to move away from the place that we could find our greatest satisfaction. In that sense, we're very strange creatures, aren't we? And so serving others, in some sense, is shepherding them back to shalom. You might say, another way that's on the screen here, you might say, it's another way to think about serving others is shepherding them back to healing in the world. And you might, as medical professionals and those training for a career in medicine, you might say, yeah, that's exactly what, that's it. That's kind of what I want to do. So I want to think about with you for a minute some of these, just some thoughts on a life of serving and the way that the Bible talks about that. So just take a few minutes to explore this biblical theme of servanthood. It's a very important theme in the biblical story. And what I would say is that our desire to serve, it's a good desire to serve. It's a great desire. But it's actually reflective of something else. In other words, it's not an end in and of itself. It reflects something else. It's not just being a nice person. It's not just doing things for someone else. What we'll see is that it reflects something of the very character of God. It reflects something of the very desire of God for flourishing. You're reflecting when you're serving. You're not just doing things. You're actually mirroring something else. You're like a prism. You're showing something else when you're serving. Now, you can get crazy. I like thinking about motivation, like why do you serve? And I do not want to talk about that tonight. We could talk about motivations for serving. The example that I use sometimes is, I didn't know Shereen was going to be here, but I'm going to use the example anyway. Why do I bring her flowers? Now, no comments about how often that is, or how not often that is, but now why? So why am I nice to her? So you can dig down into that, and you can drive yourself crazy starting to think about, now why is that? Is it really to make her happy, or is it so that, I'm going to use the example again because I still think it's true, is it so that she'll make me Cornish hen? And you're supposed to say, what's Cornish hen? Is it so that, well, we're not going to, we could talk about that, but that's not what we're going to talk about. But I want to talk about that serving, that life of servanthood, as this concept that we're reflecting something else. We're actually reflecting something about God. Early on in the biblical story, if you just kind of pick up your Bible and start flipping through it, we find servants in the Bible kind of the way that we would normally think of servants. Like in Abraham, for example. Abraham has servants, and what they do is they make his food. And they do things for Abraham that just kind of normal servant, you think of normal servants doing. They attend to him, right? They meet his needs. And so these early characters in the Bible kind of in the early stories, in the early chapters of the Bible. You see that. But it doesn't stop there. Something else happens, especially, we're going to look at in a minute, with Moses, with the character of Moses in the Bible. What we find is again, we're talking about servanthood being reflective of something else, that servanthood is not functional. That's the way that a lot of us maybe think about serving. It's what we do, right? We serve, it's functional. But servanthood, actually, when you start backing up and looking at the sweep of the biblical stories, servanthood is actually relational. Now, there's a functional aspect. You do things. Like you can't just sit on your couch and eat potato chips and say, "I'm a servant." I mean, maybe you are, but it's actually there's a functional quality to it. But it's not defined exclusively by function. It's defined through these relational categories. Something else happens, particularly beginning with Moses. There's this really, it's a passage that in my years of teaching Old Testament, I would get a lot of mileage out of this passage from Numbers 12. It's a passage that the Lord is speaking, and the Lord is speaking about Moses. He's speaking to Miriam and Aaron, and he says, and the Lord said, "Hear my words. When there are prophets among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams." So, nice biblical theology about the Lord making his will known to his prophets. But then there is a categorical distinction when he begins to talk about Moses. He says in verse 7, "Not so with," and then there's this word, "abdi," this my servant Moses. "Not so with my servant Moses." And here's the relational. "He is entrusted with all my house. With him, with my servant Moses, I speak face to face, clearly, not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord." And then the context of this passage, "Why then are you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" You see, when the Lord begins to speak about Moses, and this is the first time in the narrative about Moses that he's referred to as this servant category, the Lord is not just talking about Moses being functional. It's not just what he does. There's this relational idea that we begin, that's planted in our minds as we read the Bible and we start thinking about what servanthood is. It's not just what we do. It's actually, there's this relational function to it. There's an intimacy. He speaks face to face with him. Which, by the way, if you read like the book of Exodus and Numbers, and that's a big deal, because usually when you speak face to face with the Lord, what happens? You die. There's not a good, for you medical people, there's not a good outcome for speaking face to face with the Lord. But here, the Lord is saying, I speak to Moses face to face because what? He's my servant. There's this relational, intimate proximity between Moses and the Lord. And that is going to play a pretty significant role as we begin to unpack this idea of servanthood and being a servant in the Bible. Another way of looking at this is in servanthood, in this relational capacity. When you serve another person, there's a functional capacity to it. There's a functional element to it. But there's also this story-like quality that part of their story becomes yours and you become part of their story. There's this real relational, almost transaction that takes place in servanthood. And servanthood then becomes this incredible privilege and even an honor to bring shalom, to bring God's intention for a good creational wholeness and flourishing into a place where it is non-existent. And it involves the servant and the one being served in this larger story of wholeness and of healing in the world. And in a very small way, then to be a servant is to be involved in God's healing in the world. For Moses, revealing God's intention for justice and mercy and for wholeness and goodness, and in that sense, imaging God. There's a lot of ways that we could develop what's here, but I'd like to jump to a later prophetic book, one that I believe reflects on this aspect of servanthood, and that is the book of Isaiah. Now, there are subsequent servants in the Old Testament. Moses is probably the quintessential servant, but David is also called the Lord's servant. Joshua, at the beginning of the book of Joshua, he's not the Lord's servant, but he kind of ascends to this title through the end of the book of Joshua, where Joshua is also then given the title the servant of the Lord. So there are these other servants of the Lord. The pinnacle of the Old Testament revelation, however, I believe, comes in the book of Isaiah, when this idea of who will be the servant of the Lord is ultimately ascribed to the whole nation of Israel. The nation that kind of grew out of the promise to Abraham and the deliverance that came through Moses and Joshua, the servants of the Lord, and the kingdom that came through David, the servant of the Lord. Ultimately, the nation of Israel is conceived of as the servant of the Lord, called into this relationship and given a task functionally to serve others, but also relationally to reflect the very character of God. Israel's calling as a servant of the Lord was not just to perform duties. It was not just functional. It was for the very healing of the world, for the coming of shalom to a broken universe, reflecting God's intention. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend. Now, if I could just stop there. We could talk for like 2 hours about verse 8, but we're not going to. Can I have 2 hours? No. Whom I took from the ends of the earth and called from its farthest corners, saying to you, you are my servant. I have chosen you and not cast you off. Do not fear. Here's this relational, the servant of the Lord. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be afraid, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my victorious right hand. Now, if you read on in the book of Isaiah, particularly as you get into Isaiah chapter 42, 48, 49, into chapter 53, the calling of the servant is not always easy. It's not always a happy task. There's pain involved in being the Lord's servant, but everywhere it is for this vision of the healing of the world. As we continue thinking about servanthood in the biblical story, of course, the one that comes who ultimately turns the vision of servanthood not on its head, but gives it a cast that we might not otherwise have thought, is our Lord Jesus himself. Then they came to, this is my favorite, this is in several of the Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This is in several of, this passage is presented in several of the Gospels. Take your pick, they're all a little bit different. Each of the Gospel writers emphasizes something just a little different about Jesus' words, and the Gospel writers are allowed to do that. I personally like the way that Mark does it. I like Matthew's as well, but I really like the way that Mark does it. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, what were you arguing about on the way? And that's like when you catch your kids, like doing something wrong. I never read this passage to my kids when we caught them doing something wrong, but maybe I should have, because then I love the way that Mark says it. But they were silent. For on the way, they had argued with one another, who was the greatest? He sat down, Jesus sat down, he called the 12, his disciples, and said to them, whoever wants to be first must be last of all, and a servant of all. Upside downness of servanthood. The healing of the world then the healing of the world, and Jesus knows what he's doing here and tapping in to this biblical idea of, if you're going to serve me, if you want to be a servant, now what I'm going to do, Jesus seems to be saying, is it's not going to be for the highlight reel, like the in the park home run today at the Phillies game. There, I made a very contextualized comment for just today. So now on tape, you'll know it happened on the 15th of October, 2022. It's not for the highlight reel. Jesus is actually turning this idea of a servant, of this relational, functional role for the healing of the world. Jesus is saying it's not for the highlight reel, it's for the lowlight reel. It's for the ordinary. If you want to be the greatest, you actually go the opposite way. And you go to serve. Then he took a child, and this is going to be important in a minute. He took a little child and put the child, among them. And taking the child in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." Now, there's something really interesting for those of you who've studied a little bit of Greek. I know that was a long time ago for you. But what Jesus is doing here is actually fascinating. Because Jesus is saying, if you want to be a doulos, if you want to be a servant, you have to be a paidos, you have to be a child. Well, it turns out that Jesus is doing a very subtle little word play there. So much so, and there's a reference here, if you look in Acts chapter 3. So this is the speech, Peter's speech. "The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, the God of our ancestors, has glorified his servant Jesus, whom you handed over and rejected in the presence of Pilate, though he had decided to release him." His servant Jesus. Most of your English Bibles translate that as servant. In Acts chapter 3, here it's in verse 13. It's later on in the same chapter. It's all throughout Matthew chapter 8. This word paidos, in here it's the pais, which is the Son, Jesus. It's the Son and the servant. It actually becomes another way of saying servant is to say son. Now, think about that. Or child. It can be child. In other words, the servant, the idea of a servant is not this abstract doulos, this kind of functional, just you're going to do things for me. It's relational. The servant Jesus in Acts chapter 3 is the child Jesus, is the Son Jesus. This is all to say that servanthood is an extremely noble and difficult calling. I, being married to one in the serving capacity of healthcare for 30 some odd years. Well, I know how long we've been married, but I'm 33 years. But walking with her in her capacity as a pediatrician for all these years, I see that it's a noble, it's a high, beautiful calling. This calling into healthcare for everything that we were talking about earlier, for its functional aspect, truly its functional aspect of bringing shalom to the world and of shepherding people into shalom. It's a beautiful, wonderful calling to be undertaken in this position of weakness and humility and relying on the strength of others. It's the very story that the Bible tells us. It's the life of healthcare as a life of servanthood is this noble thing. But a quick perusal of websites leads one to believe, this is the big part of the talk tonight, that common motivation to go into healthcare as a profession, to serve one another, is very common. It's intrinsically good in a very altruistic way to desire to help others. But something happens, and the stark reality is just the reality of burnout. Just in preparing for this talk, I've talked not only to my wife, but to others. I have a lot of friends in healthcare. And you know, the reality is very great of burnout. One of the studies that I think it looked valid, but the numbers are north of 50% are chronically burned out of those in healthcare. So you've got this calling of people who want to serve others. Now I know there are other motivations about prestige and esteem and high earning potentials and all those, but let's go with serving others. It's an incredible motivation. Even those who might not be followers of God and Christ, still reflecting something about God's intention. They're called into this noble profession, but then you have this tremendous degree of burnout, you know, defined in various ways. Laura mentioned, you know, my last position was with the sending agency here in the Philadelphia area, and that sending agency, about a third of the people we sent were in healthcare, about a third in business and a third in education, but a third in healthcare. And I was the personnel director, so I spent a lot of time talking to them, and the subject of burnout came up in some, maybe not that word, but the concept came up in virtually every conversation. This idea of absolute emotional exhaustion. This idea of depersonalization, of feeling like you're just a cog in a wheel. This idea of feeling very little value in your own personal work. Those are kind of the triad of burnout. You've probably talked about this maybe in some of your first year medical or pharmacy or nursing programs, you know, just the reality of burnout, depersonalization, emotional exhaustion, and the lack of feeling of personal contribution. Okay? That terrible three-legged stool. So I'm asking the question here, if the calling is so noble, and so right, and you are so certain, what might contribute to that staggering number of burnout? What happens, I would suggest, is that if your identity as a servant, if your identity is founded upon your function as a servant, that will be insufficient. At my primary identity shaping level, if my function as a servant in healthcare, or at least my calling to that end, defines who I am, then what happens when I'm not appreciated? What happens when I can't serve enough? What happens when, at times, your best efforts at serving fall short? What happens when you run out of energy? Or when you come to that realization, and you all will, that you might not be good enough? Because, as we all know, if we're always looking around and comparing yourself, someone will always be a little bit better than you are. Really sorry. If I'm the first person who's had to say that to you, then good, and I probably won't be the last. But identity, if your identity is based on how well you serve, could that contribute to some of these staggering numbers that we read about burnout in healthcare and healthcare professions? You derive your identity from servanthood, or do you serve out of your identity? Who you are, your identity, should come prior to what you do, the function, even the function as a servant. Function does not lead to identity, but the other way around. Again, perhaps one of the reasons that burnout rates are so high in healthcare professions may be something like, I thought my identity would be so much deeper and so much more defined than it is as I struggle with the demands of serving in the modern bureaucracy of contemporary healthcare. And if you're in the throes of medical education, how I do, how I perform, if that creates your identity, and you know how subtle that is, you could be in for burnout. So I want to talk with you for just a few minutes about identity. What can fund a life of servanthood? What might it look like if we get the order right? Just some identity shaping influences. Your context is important. I was laughing about this because I was kind of reviewing my notes as we were sitting in the living room before we drove down here, and the Phillies were on, and they kept showing all the Phillies fans and they're just waving these red towels, and I thought, their context has really defined their identity. And if the Phillies lose at this point, they'll all be burned out. So that would be a perfect example for this talk. But your context, right? We at our church last Sunday, Cindy Parker was preaching, and she just nailed it. She was preaching from Acts chapter 19, and she stopped in verse 1, and she started talking about Ephesus, and she went on for a beautiful amount of time, just talking about the shaping influence that Ephesus would have on when Paul arrived there. And it's like Cindy was saying, don't go over that too quickly. Don't run by that too quickly. Ephesus, the place, was shaping itself so, in power, in wealth, in commerce, in art, in culture, in all those things in Ephesus. So think about your context in medical school, in residency. Your context is shaping you. I'm not saying get out of your context. I'm saying be aware of that. Voices are shaping you. Where is there space in your life to hear voices, to remind you of this very thing we're going to talk about in a moment? Ultimately, though, I think there's been a lot of... There's been a lot of research done in the last couple of years of the way that stories shape you as well. There's a very famous quote by a philosopher named Alistair McIntyre, who taught for many years at Notre Dame. And Alistair McIntyre, in his book, After Virtue, and I can still remember as a sophomore in college, pre-med, taking a philosophy class almost because I had to, and being assigned After Virtue, this book by Alistair McIntyre. I can still remember reading this quote back in 1984. And he says this: I can only answer the question, what am I to do? Function. If I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part? In other words, something must precede this question of function, of what you are to do. Now, he goes on in that really remarkable book to talk about stories that shape virtue, but we don't have time to get into that right now. A contemporary scholar named James Smith, who teaches at Calvin University, has done a lot of thinking about, kind of in the vein of Alistair McIntyre, of our story. The story that shapes us is our story, is God's healing of the world, and we participate. So from Jamie's book, Desiring the Kingdom, we begin to absorb the story as moral and ethical compass, not because it disclosed to us abstract and ahistorical axioms, which is a lot of the way that we read the Bible, story of God, is we want to derive these when he says abstract and unhistorical axioms from it. Jamie's saying, no, but because it narrates the telos of creation, the shape of the kingdom we are looking for, thus fulfilling in the telos of our own action, we begin to absorb the plot of the story and begin to see ourselves as characters within it. Now, where he's going in that book is as characters within it, contributing as those who, with God, are bringing about the shalom of the world. That dovetails beautifully with calling into healthcare professions. We becoming a people with a disposition to the good as it is envisioned in the story. Another way of looking at this is by a scholar, pastor, who we're talking about in a moment, named Henry Nouwen, who's had a really profound impact on me. And in one of his books on spiritual direction, he writes this: to live a life in the memory of Jesus Christ means, first of all, that the memory is a healing memory. How does the memory of Jesus Christ heal? The memory of Jesus Christ heal because it lifts up our small life and brings it in connection with a much larger event, a larger story. As Christians, we are participating in a memory that goes far, far back to that great moment when God himself entered into history and shared the human condition. When our little history can be connected with the great history of salvation, a tremendous change starts taking place. Because our little pains and our little joys are no longer just little pains and little joys, but they point beyond themselves to a great event of salvation of which we have become a part. Our lives can be healed by the memory of the incarnation and the story of salvation. In other words, the story of God's coming into the world, shaping the world, can begin to change you. That relational capacity of servanthood. Your story, in part, forms your identity, right? So you've got these voices and context and story all contribute to the way that you answer that question. What is that question? I am. I am a good person. I am a smart person. I'm a humble person, like Moses. I'm a busy person. I'm an esteemed person. I'm a gifted person. Perhaps some of you are more self-critical. I am a privileged person. Some of you are more, perhaps, negatively self-reflective. I'm a misunderstood person. I want to suggest something far deeper as we begin to close here, and probably less functional than any of those things. And it goes back to, again, the Gospel of Mark. You can tell I've been teaching the Gospel of Mark at Missio Seminary recently. I've been thinking about the Gospel of Mark a lot the last two years or so. Going back to the Gospel of Mark's telling of the baptism of Jesus. And this is going to really connect with this little book by Henry Nouwen called Life of the Beloved, which I would, if we had it in a budget, I would have brought copies for all of you tonight, because I think if you're in healthcare, to read this book and to center your identity as one who goes through these words of one who is chosen, broken, sent, and given. To center yourself on that as a beloved child of God makes all the difference in the world. So in the Gospel of Mark, in those days Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, the Beloved. With you I am well pleased." Now there's so much going on in these brief verses that I would love to spend some time unpacking with you. You know, that idea, I even put it in italics, the idea that heaven's being torn apart, answering the great longing of Isaiah chapter 64, where the prophet actually prays, "Oh, that you would tear apart the heavens and come down." Here in Mark's account of the baptism of Jesus, Mark is saying, guess what? That great longing in Isaiah chapter 64, that happened when Jesus was baptized. God came down, and the Spirit is given. So much more to say about that, but we're not going to say about that because we have 5 minutes. But the focus of that declaration, you are a child, you are the beloved. With you I am well pleased. There's that very Trinitarian context of the Father speaking, giving the Spirit to the Son. You are the beloved, or you are the beloved, you are my beloved Son. That intimate relationship with the Trinity, the Son being the beloved of the Father. And I know firsthand what that's like as a father. We just got back from family vacation, annual family vacation. And one of those family vacations, it's just going to happen every once in a while, where all 3 of our kids flew in on different flights on different days. And it was just, and where we were staying was about 40 miles from the airport, so it was a lot of driving for Papa Kelly. But you see your child at the airport, and you just kind of think, it's my son, it's my daughter. They haven't done anything. They're just there. They're just showing up at the airport. And you have this sense of, that is my beloved daughter. That is my beloved son. There's something deeply relational about that. And again, we're talking about Jesus, the servant of the Lord. How does that relate to us? I'm going to make a little theological move here, and it's an important theological move. How does this come to us? And that theological little move that I want to make is, and I put doctrine in quotes here because it's so much more than a doctrine. The doctrine of union with Christ. It's the doctrine that does indeed change everything. It's all, if you read through the New Testament, it's all the in Christ, with Christ, in Him, with Him, through Him. It's all those adjectives that relate you to Jesus. And it's all these adjectives that have to do with in and through and with, and all of these wonderful little adjectives like we find in Romans 6. You have been baptized into Christ. You have been raised with Christ. You have been crucified with Christ. It's all those in Christ, with Christ. The concept is striking, actually. It occurs, several different counts here, but the book that I have that I always go to for this, it explicates 242 times in the New Testament. This is an important idea that you actually participate with Christ, in Christ, through Christ, with Christ. Albert Schweitzer, who was not only a great theologian but also a physician, he said this in the early 20th century, this being in Christ, this is what he says, is the prime enigma of the Bible teaching. Once grasped, it gives the clue to the whole. In other words, Schweitzer is saying this is the approach to our life, our spiritual life, that opens everything else up. And I think Schweitzer is absolutely right. So Christ's story becomes our story by His grace and His power. We are united to that very same Jesus. That very same Jesus to whom God said, my beloved child, in whom I am well pleased. Everything that is Christ, that is Christ, has become yours. His good and right standing with God, His sacrifice for sin on the cross, His victory in the resurrection. He shares all of those things with you, as Paul talks about in Romans 6. He also shares this declaration with you. that you are the beloved child. You are the beloved God. Now, what might it look like if that declaration is the declaration of our identity? That foundationally you are the beloved of God, standing in Jesus Christ. If that identity formed the foundation of that life of serving, might it look different? Still serving the same way, loving people the same way, not at all diminishing the call or vocation in healthcare to serving people, but doing so in tremendous freedom with that tremendous voice of affirmation and love in your head and in your heart that you yourself are the beloved of God. Could that be one of the ways that growing in that identity, we can begin to combat the reality of burnout in healthcare? Burnout and I would say not just in healthcare, by the way, I would say in every serving profession. I used to tell my seminary students all the time when I was teaching, I would say, you know what it's like that when the phone rings at 10 o'clock and you're the pastor and the phone, or you're the elder or whatever, and the phone rings at 10 o'clock and you have caller ID and it's that person. And you just know that it's that emotional exhaustion. What if grounding us is not the function of being servant, but the relational declaration of being beloved, the beloved of God in Jesus Christ? Vicki Flippin of the Church of the Village in New York City says this, and I'll just close with this. I tell folks that baptism in the church baptism is the church declaring what has always been true, that each of us belongs to God and only to God. The child is claimed by God above all claims. Here it is. No one determines our worth in this world or the next other than God. You, friends in Christ, you are the beloved of God. Let this be the foundation of your life in healthcare. And even as you begin an academic year or take exams or whatever, let this be a reminder to you tonight of this wonderful declaration of who you are. I said 45 minutes, and so that was 45 minutes. Talk about the last slide if there are questions.
We did have one that was sent in, and I thought it was a nice overarching question. Why do we always seem to forget our identity in Christ?
I bet you that if I handed out note cards. Oh, well, no. Funny thing you should ask that question, because the last slide, well, it answered at least some of that. First of all, I think, why do we forget? I think that we may as well be honest with ourselves that we are always in a battle, that it's not like we wake up every day. In other words, there needs to be a self-conscious place of what we talked about, hearing those voices, reminding ourselves of the story, because we forget. One of the most common, it's not the most common, it's one of the most common, well, there's a scholar, an Old Testament scholar at North Park Seminary who did this study, and I'll just go on his word here. But the most common command in the Old Testament is listen. Listen, listen. Why is it that we need to be constantly told to listen to voices, listen to others? It's because we forget. And so I think one of the reasons that, why do we forget is we don't make place, we don't make space to listen for the voices that are true. I also think that we don't make space because the voices that we're surrounded with are very loud. The voices of the world are just very, very loud. And that just makes it, I think, all the more necessary to have these things like, well, I know for me, I've been in a season of really moving away from, I'm pretty tenacious at this point about my meditation time. And it's not a traditional quiet time. It has a lot of the components of a traditional quiet time, scripture, prayer for other people. But it's actually meditation. It actually is creating a space every day to just listen for God's voice. And that's going to look different for every person. It's going to look, you might have to be outside to do that. You might have to, Andy Crouch says, good word from Andy Crouch, screen before sky. Sorry, sky before screen. There we go. Very important correction from my wife there. Yeah, sky before screen. Like reminding yourself, I am small, before you start looking at email or, assignments or your to-do list for the day. Like just those sorts and that's a liturgy. What that is it's a liturgy, which is where we were going to go. That's another thing that James Smith talks about in several of his books on the Road with Augustine, on Desiring the Kingdom. He talks about this idea of why we forget, because we fill our lives with liturgies that would never remind us of what is actually true. And those liturgies shape us.
Liturgies meaning kind of
Habits.
things you hear and thoughts and
habits that you have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like the habit of the alarm going off in the morning. And that's just, if you have your alarm on your phone, like I do, you have to look at your phone in the morning. Maybe we should all go back to the old, alarm clocks.
What I thought of while you were speaking is, not only do we forget, we need to listen because we're distracted.
Yeah.
That distraction is a huge element to our society and our culture. And it's the sparkliest thing wins, or the shiniest ad, or the most,
Or the most provocative 128 characters.
Yeah, is what wins the day.
Yep.
Is what grabs your attention.
Yep.
And everyone's attention.
Yeah.
Almost collectively, everyone's. And like you said, making time to kind of step away from that.
Yeah.
Is important but hard to do.
It's hard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it takes efforts. It takes effort, and it takes community, and it takes, one of the things that I was going to say, I'll just go over what I was going to, the 3 points, is just cultivating spiritual friendships. Like just cultivating a friendship with someone. Earlier this week, I don't know if any of you read the New York Times, but there was this really fascinating essay in the New York Times this week about the loneliness crisis that has hit in the last 30 years. So it predates COVID, and the author, the essayist in the Times said, in 1990, 3% of Americans said they had no close friends. In 2021, 12% said the same. Like a 400% increase in the number of people who say, I don't have any close friends. And she's talking about this friendship crisis. So cultivating spiritual friendships, making space to listen to God because of distraction, because of busyness, because of by reading, by doing an examine at the end of the day, reviewing your day, where was I angry, where was I dejected, paying attention to your feelings. And in those things, where did I know God's love? In those things. And then giving thanks for his love. Think about the liturgies, the customs, the habits that shape you, like those sorts of...
Explain, just for people who don't, the concept of examine, or what actually the word means.
Yeah, the daily examine is a Jesuit, is a Roman Catholic Jesuit practice that oftentimes is traditionally done at the end of the day, and it's what's up here. It's just, it can take 5 minutes, it can take an hour, but I try to do it every day. I try to just sit at least for a couple minutes and say, how did I experience the day? In other words, paying attention to your emotions. Where was I angry? Where was I happy? Where was I sad? Like, how did I experience the day? And in a very wonderful Roman Catholic way, validating those things, saying those things are real. Like, you felt really, really lonely. Like, I was just out with my mom for a week, 2 weeks ago. That's right. And there was this one time I was talking to my mom about watching football. It was just, are we going to watch football tonight? It was going to be that Thursday night game that was that atrocious, the Denver Broncos game.
The low scoring.
No
Yeah, it was just no
Train
touchdown
field
game.
goals.
Oh, it was the worst game ever. And my mom and I were talking about it because it was going to be a Broncos game. And it was very interesting. I said, my dad has been passed for 4 years now. So he died almost 4 years ago. And I just said, it's so funny. I was just telling my mom, when the Broncos used to call, I would always have the phone sitting like by when I was watching the game. I would have the phone sitting there, and the phone would ring, and I would know it was my dad. Because my dad, like if there was a bonehead play, the Broncos, or a good play, my dad would just call and he'd just say, "See that, Mikey? Oh, I can't believe it." They would hang up. That was the extent of my dad's conversational skills, But the thing is, I said that to my mom, and all of a sudden, all of this emotion welled up in me, and I started tearing up. And I was like, where did that come from? And at the exam at the end of that day, I just kind of said, Lord, that you were with me at that point, and that was acknowledging that, and I'm giving thanks that you were with me.
Yeah.
So those kind of doing that, and then working, not stopping with that, but actually then acknowledging and looking for God's presence in those things. So it's a discipline that you get into, and if you just Google examine, as it's spelled up here, the practice of that, there are so many different formulas for doing it, and I'm not really that keen on whether there's a formula or not. What I'm very keen on in my own life, is whether I'm self-reflective at the end of the day and say, this is actually how I experience the world today. And it's brought a lot of healing in my life. Just, again, it's kind of establishing the rhythm, establishing the habit to do that, because the power of habit is really, really intense. And if you're into like neuroscience, there's this great book. Do you remember who wrote The Power of Habit? He's an NYU professor. He's in the business school.
It's worth reading.
The book is called The Power of Habit. It's worth reading. He delves into, he's not a neuroscientist. I don't think he's a neuroscientist by training, but he's in business. But he talks about the neuroscience and the power of habits. And they're important. That's what Jamie Smith is talking about in a lot of his works too, is they're not just things that you do, they actually have a shaping effect on you. Yeah.
I guess I did have a question. I was just like thinking, I guess could you talk a little bit more about the child or servant to child or child to servant? Because I think I might have seen like the doulos used in the context of like slaves, and I would love to kind of hear about like sort of like the relational like jump, and like it's sort of like identity and relational.
Yeah, that's great. So if you read like back in, so this is a word. So these are words, okay. So there's a difference between a word and kind of a concept. So like the word, that word, like diakonos, maybe I said doulos. It's diakon. It's from servant. Yeah, it's for servant. That word can mean the word can mean many things. The fascinating, the point that I was trying to make on that going from Mark into Acts 3 is that the concept of servant became so in the new in kind of Koine Greek, in the Greek language, it became so bound up with a relational of what you are as a dikainos, as a servant, that it actually took on this other word group, the paidos word, the pediatrics, like the children word group, where that's the point I was trying to make, was even in the use of paidos, like in Acts 3 and in Matthew 8, which we didn't look at, but that's the centurion saying, my servant is, which clearly it's his servant, but he's calling his servant his paidos, his son. And that there's this relational connection there that I think we oftentimes we don't think of it enough, because servanthood and serving is this very functional thing that we do. And I'm trying to look at tonight as we're trying to say there's this relational capacity to being a servant as well. Ultimately, the servant of the Lord through Moses and Israel, and into the way that Jesus himself is referred to as the servant. So it's a pretty significant shift if you just kind of think about it. It can be.
Thank you. I feel like I made a lot of new connections as well from what you were saying. Yeah, I think you mentioned there being a received aspect of one's identity from God, and then also like some sort of aspect you also develop. Say you were mentioning Joshua like rose into servanthood, or one becomes, I guess, closer in union with Christ. So I guess my impression is that a lot of these exercises are strengthening your identity that you receive from God, or your perception of being God's servant. I was wondering if you had any sort of suggestions or ways that, say, physicians or people in medicine or healing professions, whether they can, I guess, make cultural liturgies or more in the public square, things that can reinforce their servanthood, I guess along the lines of cultural liturgies being faced.
That's such a great question, and it's something that I think Dr. Layer should think about a lot, because I think that's what like MCO is trying to do, is helping you establish those liturgies in healthcare, because you're, again, not being in healthcare myself, but being closely, very closely related to healthcare. The busyness and the distraction are just so immense. I mean, it is actually like being a pastor. It's kind of like you're kind of off duty, but you're kind of never off duty, because part of your brain is always there. And so the pastor is a helping profession, and being in the healing professions, I mean, there's a lot of similarity between those. In healthcare professions, do you have any insight into that?
I was going to say, I think for as long as I've been in healthcare, there is a shift about there's a better way of, you all are being taught differently than I was taught, about the awareness and the humility of dealing with patients. It used to be, I don't know if you would say this, we were just taught to tell people what to do, right? And now there's this acknowledgement of their context, so their story, their situation, and what can they do? What can they do, and how can I understand that, and how can we work together? It's much more of a collegial. Yeah, it's much more of a cooperative relationship than it used to be very patriarchal, I think. The physician comes into the room and says, you have to, but I think there is a big acknowledgement now. The trick is to try to figure out how to know the patient in front of you, because I think that, to me, is still really interesting.
In a limited amount of time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
again, because, 20 minutes.
You're also part of a
Yeah.
bureaucracy. You are part of it is a bureaucratic healthcare system. It's not a system set up to be a servant. That's the way, I way overstated that. It's a system that's set up in some tension, I can say that easily, in some tension with this life of relational servanthood that we're talking about, because there is this bureaucracy. And so, your great question is, so what liturgies do you create to remind yourself of these things in healthcare? I know that, especially, I would say, walking through, especially an intern year with a pediatrician, there were a lot of pretty raw emotions that intern year. 2 pediatricians sitting here can attest to that. Being in the NICU, being in the just things in the ER that you see, especially if you're training in a context of urban Philadelphia or urban anywhere. Not just that doesn't have to be urban, but you see things. And I think getting ahead of the game, that could be really important. Getting ahead of the game and saying, I actually need some spiritual friendships here. And I have to create a space, because I'm going to be busy and stressed in a different way than I am as a medical student. You're busy and stressed as a medical student. When you get into residency, you're busy and stressed in a different way. You're still busy and stressed, but you're busy and stressed differently. There can be a lot more kind of emotional stress, and that very conscious getting ahead of it and saying, I need a place to actually stop every day. And it might not be, you're not going to have an hour a day, but I think it's really important to have some time every day to say, what did I experience today? And then have friends, spiritual friends, not friends that you watch. It's great to have friends that you kind of watch sports with or do projects with or whatever, go for walks with. Functional friends, that's great. Spiritual friendship is this whole idea of, the Bernard of Blue, 13th century Cistercian monk says, I am here, we are here, you and I pray a third Christ is in our midst. Like that being the prayer of a spiritual friend, where there's this conscious acknowledgement that we together will grow in Christ. And cultivating a friendship like that, I think, is important. As a liturgy, as a practice, as a habit. It's not just on days that you have a terrible day where your preceptor has yelled at you for not knowing something that you probably should have known, something like that. But just bad days, or days when you see like terrible suffering. But on days that this was a great day, like actually getting into that habit, that practice, that liturgy of saying, I'm going to stop on those days too.
So you talked about for us as pursuing kind of life of servanthood and trying to work towards that as falling back on our source of truth, which we have the church, we have the Bible, and, but as people in the healthcare field, we're going to be interacting with people that are not sharing the common source of truth. So how should we kind of go about working to build up those people and encouraging them when we know we don't share a common source of truth? What can we say to them that can be meaningful but might not be exactly like, oh, go read this Bible verse and you'll be encouraged.
Yeah, which probably won't work, or it won't
Right.
work the way that you want it to work.
And
Were you gonna say
I was
something?
going to say, someone else actually submitted that very same
Oh, really?
question. So, and she wasn't able to come today. She let us know that she was in the meeting. But
Yeah.
that's a common question.
So, one of the ways is, well, people will notice the way that you treat people. Especially in residency, as you get to be a senior resident and you get to start supervising younger physicians. You never have to throw a Bible verse at them. You know, our pastor in North Carolina used to say, I'm going to get it exact. I'm not going to get the quote exactly right the way that Dave used to say this, but not everyone needs to know you're a Christian, but they shouldn't be surprised when they find out that you are. It's kind of like, huh? Yeah, kind of like you don't have to go around. In other words, you show, right? You show. So, like, you don't have to like give a Bible verse to everything or something like that. But the way that you show people it should be consistent with shalom. The way that you treat people should be consistent with shalom. And I think that you have an impact on people that way. And I know for a fact that your patients will know that. Your patients will know if they have been treated with dignity where the rest of the world does not treat them, or maybe outside of maybe their immediate family, they struggle, they claw for dignity. And when they come into an office for healthcare and they're treated with dignity, there's a shaping. Again, we're talking about the way that liturgies, the way that stories are enacted and lived out. There is a way that people get that. And so, living consistently, which we're never going to be able to do, okay, so, but growing into living consistently, right? Becoming more consistent, which is always like one of our professors at seminary always used to say that the spiritual life is like a slinky. Remember what that is? Oh man. Now, age, but remember the slinky, the thing, but like a slinky going upstairs, which you normally think of a slinky going downstairs. But Dr. Davis used to say it's like a slinky going upstairs where you go like this. So there's always this arc movement where you're still going, the arc of everything is going up, but there's always this down, right? There's an up and then down, and then up and then down, and up and then down. And that image has stuck with me for 30 years. So you're growing into that capacity of mirroring God's healing, God himself mirroring his healing. And you don't have, there's a lot of common grace and there's just a lot of common grace. There's a lot of room for common grace. Maybe I should, that would be a really interesting article to write for a medical journal, for a Christian medical journal, how much room there is for common grace in medical practice. I'm sure there are essays written about that, but it's ripe for that kind of reflection.
I was going to say almost that same thing, that sometimes I just ask people, what is it about life or health that you think is worth protecting or promoting, right? Because there's a lot of shared values, even if they're not. Mike and I always talk about kingdom values, right? So God's kingdom is over all the earth, right? So there's justice, mercy, and lots of non-Christians are living those values. They don't know why or how. But we talk a lot about how do you call those values out in your colleagues, even if they don't understand the same basis of it. right? And that's what common grace is. And there's a lot of kindness and truth and dignity and, you know, elimination of poverty. We can all agree on those things. We don't have to all have the same theology to work together and promote those things. There are plenty of places where theology really matters, but there's always, yeah, we often come back, or if I'm talking to people about an experience, I often say, how do you think it matters in the bigger picture, right? Because even if people don't want to talk about God, they're often aware of what a bigger picture, because we know we're finding. So there's lots of ways you can have those conversations. Some are more successful than others.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you could, if you would be so bold, I mean, you could figure out what the theme is, and then say, well, the Bible's, you know, believe it or not, that's a biblical concept. It may be a concept in other major world religions as well, but it's a biblical concept illustrated this way.
Yeah.
And they don't realize, they never made that connection, and you can help them make that connection.
And it takes wisdom, right, to know when that moment is to say, you know, I'm a Christian, and this is why I do what I do.
Yeah. And somewhat on a similar note, you mentioned the number, like it was upwards of 50% of people burn out, but
55% was the report or the study that I read.
Gotcha. And of the number that aren't burning out, obviously not all of them are Christians. So they're living in such a way that like something in their life is sustaining them to keep going.
Right.
How would you, I guess, like we just talked about, like there's common values that we share that are biblical in some sense, but what in their life is enabling them to keep having a life of what we call servanthood, or living in the healthcare field without letting them burn out? And are there like flaws to take away from that, or like key concept that we can share with them? That's an open-ended question too. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, thank you.
I would say,
Because I was going to say,
Let's talk
I'm
about it.
thinking of some people, but it's very abstract. You can speak more.
no, I had a conversation with a lovely young woman who's one of my residents this past weekend. There's a lot of, not just in medicine, but across the board, people are talking about joy. Right?
Yeah.
What's joy? What brings you joy? And how do you perceive that? And she and I were talking about her mother is a palliative care nurse and sees death all the time, but she is so joyful. And so her daughter, who's my resident, we were talking about how does she do that? How does she sustain herself? And we didn't come up with an answer, but what I think we were getting toward is her mom has this concept of servanthood, so she definitely has an outward other phase, but she keeps herself healthy in a mental health kind of a way for the purpose of serving, not just for herself, right? So what we're seeing, the whole wellness culture, a lot of people are trying to be well just for themselves, right? But she recognized that her mom does all these really fun, crazy things to keep well and have joy for the purpose of serving, right? And so she was able to tell me that she thinks her mom has this, she's keeping herself well and being joyful, but it's for the purpose of other people, not for herself. And so she, to my knowledge, this lovely person isn't a believer, but we started just talking about the focus again, of where is it? Because we all see so many people who are in the wellness thing, but it's all about them. Before I give anything, I'm going to make myself well, right? And so we just had this fun conversation about, she sees it in her mom. She's got it the opposite way. That's exactly what you said.
And I wonder if there are just some people who are wired, people in healthcare professions who are just wired not to be completely absorbed by their vocation. But still be good at it, but just not allow that to dominate. I know I don't know the numbers on this, but of the 2,500 or so seminarians that I trained over 20 years, there are a lot of them. One of the reasons I don't go on Facebook anymore is because it was just getting so depressing. Because all these former students who are my Facebook friends would say, and they didn't like moral failure, leave the ministry, or they just burned out in the ministry. They're just like, I'm going to go sell insurance. It's like, again, this is not a scientific study. This is not a scientific study. But some of them, not all of them, some of them you could see the seeds of that while they were in seminary, where this is who they were. Is I'm going to be a pastor, and then you get to be a pastor, and you don't cultivate other friendships, and you don't cultivate other habits of recreation in your life, and all of a sudden that thing, healthcare, business, you name it, that thing that you've strived your whole life for doesn't actually flower into everything that you thought it was going to, and then you're left with nothing. But then you get to be in your 40s, and you're still saddled with student debt, and you just feel like, I got to keep going. I'm trapped. And pastors are too, because they run up all these seminary. And, building up seminary debt is never a good idea, because you're going into one of the lowest paying professions in the history of humanity, and you shouldn't borrow money for your master's degree. Okay.
Just two disciples. I could not do the work that I do without my small group, my church small group. So I would just put in a plug for that. That potential,
Spiritual friendships.
There are people. I've been in the same small group since 1996.
Wow.
Older than some of you guys even. And they're still, and I'm still kind of the new girl. There are people who've been in the same group long. And then I had another friend who's a psychiatry PA who gave a talk for us about kind of trauma in healthcare. This was during the height of the pandemic, and everybody's dying, and healthcare people are getting sick, and some healthcare people are dying. And his main point was, you will be poured out. You will be. Avoiding burnout in some ways is a fallacy. You will burn out, but then where do you go to get the flame again? Where do you go to be refilled? Where do you go? And that's the key. That's the key. Where do you go? And the idea of balance is balance is the swing back and forth across the center point. That's about, because sometimes you're over here and sometimes you're over here. And sometimes you're over here. And you're never in the middle.
Right.
Hardly ever. Most people are never in the middle. So just realize that that's going to happen, and that's okay. And then you will burn out. I don't mean burn out like leave the profession, but you will be exhausted, you will be tired, things will be bad, but where do you go to be replenished? And as you said, do you do that daily? Do you do it once a week in small group? How do you do that?
Have something.
And where is it? And is it focused on Christ?
And if that call, I would love to talk to your friend about that, because if that call to that vocation is actually relational and not functional, then that you have built into it, you have where you're going to go. Because where you're going to go is not to the function of what you're doing. Where you're going to go is deeper into that relational fabric that is funding your work. So.